In summer, the land is green. It's a green that moves with the wind and trades darker shades for lighter at the whim of sun and clouds. You can see distance in the green, and you can hear the far-off echoes of history, and the nearby roar and clatter of life and commerce. It's the grass that gives the green, that spurred the history, that fuels the fire of trade and livelihood. From a distance, the grass is all there is, a thick, deep pile, wall-to-wall carpet of green that seems to invite bare feet and insightful eyes. These hills are not named for the grass, though, but for the steel-hard rock it hides. For it is the rock, the nearly hidden, ankle-twisting, gray and white rock, that allows the grass to grow. And that allows this part of the Tallgrass Prairie to exist, largely unchanged from the time more than a century ago when a man with a vision decided this was the place for his home. He called it the Spring Hill Ranch, and it sits amid the stunning splendor of one of nature's finest achievements, the Flint Hills of Kansas. The Spring Hill Ranch, or as it most recently has been called, the Z-Bar, is nearly 11,000 acres of grass and rocks and cattle. But what most people see and associate with whichever name they prefer is the house, the barn, and the outbuildings. The house grows out of the side of a hill, a collection of angles and textures that contrast vividly with the surrounding gentleness of grass and trees. And unlike the trees, the house is startling, a jolting surprise in a landscape of softness where the evidence of man's handiwork in this form is rare. For the house was meant to stand out, to be different, to command the admiration of those whose attention might be centered instead on the hills and the grass. When Stephen F. Jones came to Chase County, Kansas in 1878, he brought 82 carloads of fine Colorado cattle. And as the locals said at the time,
he had money sticking out of every pocket.
Kansas was a relatively young state in those days, not even a quarter century old, and the country was raw, unbroken, and big. Jones bought land, and within 2 years had started work on a house, barn, and outbuildings. Eventually, he would own more than 7,000 acres and be president of the local bank. It was mighty quick for the development of a cattle empire. As a matter of fact, it was fast for the creation of just about anything in these old hills. Always before, the significant changes had taken years to accomplish, sometimes hundreds, thousands, even millions of years. The hands of the geological clock move with agonizing slowness. The Flint Hills developed over eons as a result of a most unlikely combination of water, ice, drought, and fire. About 500 million years ago, this part of east central Kansas was the bed of a vast sea. Time after time, this inland ocean rose and receded, and each time it withdrew, it left behind the debris of its passing. Heavy sheets of sediment that baked and hardened into layers of bedrock, including the limestone and steel-tough chert, commonly called flint, that was formed between 200 and 300 million years ago and gives the name to the resulting hills. About 70 million years ago, only a few ticks on our geological clock, the sea receded for the final time. And practically yesterday, geologically, about 10,000 years ago, the last of the glaciers that had covered much of the northern part of the continent finally melted. With that, the area's climate began to change. There was much less moisture, and native grasses began to exert their dominance. Few trees can survive with little moisture, and most die during periods of drought. But grass simply becomes dormant, its seeds and roots reviving with renewed rainfall. The final element that plays a role in this survival of the fittest on the prairie is fire. Through the years, random lightning strikes have often sparked raging pillars of flame that swept across the prairie, killing helpless trees and other invasive plants, but actually stimulating the deeply buried roots of native grasses. And thus the grass dominates and is king of its domain from horizon to horizon. Not long ago, the far horizon of this sea of grass was more distant than it is today. In fact, over the past few thousand years, North American grasslands have stretched from northern Canada into Mexico, from the foothills of the Rockies to the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. In North America, this blanket of prairie spread itself over 400,000 square miles. Its makeup of short grass, mixed grass, or tall grass like that in the Flint Hills was largely determined by rainfall, or the lack of it. Today, only a minuscule percentage of the original prairie survives. Bits and pieces of grassland, fragmented reminders of the ancient past, dot the American Midwest. At nearly 11,000 acres, the Z-Bar Spring Hill Ranch is one of the largest protected prairies in the country. The largest single remaining portion of this nearly perfect ecosystem is in the Flint Hills of Kansas, a narrow strip of geologic wonder that slides like a raindrop on a window pane the length of Kansas from Nebraska to Oklahoma. There is one main reason it remains. There is one substance that has preserved this final remnant of a sprawling prairie that awed the first explorers, frightened early settlers, and inspired poetry in later visitors. The substance, of course, is flint. Even with steel blades, the rocky, often steep sides of the Flint Hills could not be plowed. The Flint Hills thus escaped the agricultural incursion that consumed virtually all of the prairie. Before the sodbusters, though, there were others. Most archaeologists believe the first human occupants of what was to become Kansas came to North America about 12,000 years ago via the land bridge across the Bering Strait. Strangely, the area's then semi-arid climate created an environment suitable for mammoths, camels, sloths, and prehistoric bison that early man hunted for his livelihood. More recently, Kansas and the Flint Hills were home to several tribes of Plains Indians. In the late 1600s, Father Jacques Marquette recorded the presence of Kansa, Osage, and Pawnee Indians as he explored this part of the country. Various other Native American tribes roamed across the Flint Hills throughout early history, if not to actually live here, at least to explore the land and to hunt that most important of animals, the buffalo. By 1803, when Thomas Jefferson negotiated the Louisiana Purchase, smack in the middle of which were the verdant Flint Hills, few white men had crossed the prairie. When they began to come, they quickly named it the Great American Desert.
These vast plains of the Western Hemisphere may become in time equally celebrated as the sandy deserts of Africa. Lieutenant Zebulon Pike, from his journal, September 1806.
Others echoed Pike's misjudgment, and before long, those who used the prairie simply as a highway to the promise of the West Coast were equally unforgiving in their descriptions.
Camped last night in the prairie. Made our beds down in the tent in the wet and mud. Bedclothes nearly spoiled. Cold and cloudy this morning, and everybody out of humor. Husband is scolding and hurrying all hands, and Elmira says she wished she was home, and I say ditto. Home sweet home. Amelia Stewart Knight, on the way to Oregon, from her diary, 1853.
Nevertheless, they came, and some of them stayed. The homesteaders broke up as much of the prairie as they could, but avoided the rough Flint Hills. While some took the long northern route to Oregon and California, and while some began to sink roots into the rich Kansas soil, a new breed of entrepreneur was crossing the Flint Hills just north of the as yet unborn Spring Hill Ranch on the Santa Fe Trail. Council Grove was a famous rendezvous point on this nearly 800-mile trail of hardship and danger. Prior to the railroads, it was the longest commercial route in the United States. Still, some of these hard-bone, commercial-minded travelers actually found some beauty on the trail. Not surprisingly, much of it was on the Tallgrass Prairie.
The prairie here in the month of May is adorned with a great variety of flowers and probably presents some of the most distant and beautiful views on Earth. Augustus Stores, 1824.
During the Santa Fe Trail days, Kansas began to earn another kind of reputation, not all of it positive. Western movies have long chronicled the Wild West, much of which was centered around the Kansas cowtowns of Abilene, Ellsworth, and Dodge City. When Stephen F. Jones brought his cattle to Chase County in 1878, Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson were peace officers in Dodge City and were frequently joined in friendly poker hands by their friend Doc Holliday. Jones had, no doubt, heard of the famous trio, but probably had more important things on his mind, like getting his cattle out into the lush Tallgrass Prairie just north of Strong City, Kansas. Little did he know the role he was playing was helping to strengthen the culture of the cowboy that would dominate the Flint Hills for decades.
Flint Hills is cattle country and cowboy country. We're not quite as flashy and flamboyant maybe as in West Texas or up in Montana. Not everybody around here wears a big hat, but they might have their feed store cap on. But when they get on a horse to go out and work in the pastures, yes, they're very good. Over the years, Kansas has produced 9 world's champion rodeo cowboys, and 6 of those have lived in the Flint Hills. So this is definitely cowboy country. The first reference I've been able to find to cattle being pastured in the Flint Hills is from 1856. That's only 2 years after the Kansas-Nebraska Act opened up Kansas for settlement. But as far as the type of business it is today, where they bring in the cattle for the grazing season in the spring, ship them out in the fall, that probably was starting up in the 1870s, 1880s. And it's along in this time, the 1870s, that Stephen Jones comes from Colorado and buys Spring Hill Ranch and begins to put cattle in there too, begins to develop. He's part of the development of the cattle industry here in the Flint Hills. The railroad was the major factor in the development of the cattle industry, the cattle trailing industry, the development of the cowboy, because without the big trail drives from Texas up to Kansas, to the railheads at Newton and Abilene, Wichita, Dodge City, Ellsworth, there wouldn't have been a cowboy. Flint Hills grass is the best grass in the world for putting weight on a steer. The nice thing about it is they require no fertilizer, they require no reseeding. You simply have to not overgraze, take care of the grass, burn it once every 2 or 3, 4 years maybe, get a nice even graze on it, but it's renewable.
By 1871, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad had reached Chase County and would soon make the wagon trains of the Santa Fe Trail obsolete. The railroad, with its Cottonwood Station at what is now Strong City, named for the railroad's president, by the way, provided the means for Stephen Jones to get his family, goods, and cattle to Kansas. Jones also brought his proven business savvy. Like other stockmen around the country, he had heard of the Flint Hills and determined this was where he would enlarge his personal fortune.
The grasses growing from this soil are superior in their quality for fattening stock, and the sheltered sides of the bluffs, the nooks at the head of the valleys with the abounding timber, make this a peculiarly good country for the raising and fattening of cattle. From the History of Kansas, 1883.
Within a few years, Jones had increased his holdings from the original 160 acres to more than 7,000. He soon began building an impressive stone house and several outbuildings on the side of a hill overlooking Fox Creek. The house was built on property originally included as part of a government land grant to the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad. Local contractor David Rediger, whose stone quarry north of Strong City was reputed to be among the finest in the state, used Chase County limestone for most of the buildings.
20 men worked day and night to construct the buildings, and reports say the activity was so intense that travelers often thought they had reached Strong City and tried to put up for the night. Traditional story from the local people at the time.
The dormers of the house and its mansard roof are characteristic of the Second Empire style of 19th century architecture. The terraces, the cut rock stairs, the wrought iron fences, and the plantings of roses and lilacs were the frame of the picture the house made as it sat majestically on its hill. But just as important were the springs located on the hillside, which supplied water to the house and to an elaborate fountain. The name then was easy, the Spring Hill Ranch. The 11-room ranch house quickly became a showpiece. A tunnel links the kitchen with the spring house. Cool, slow-flowing spring water ran through the building and for years provided the only refrigeration. Also off the kitchen is the root cellar, or, since Mrs. Jones was terrified of Kansas tornadoes, the storm cellar. Here, a constant temperature and humidity provided preservation of roots throughout the winter months. Other buildings included an ice house, a chicken house, a smokehouse, and of course, the outhouse. The massive barn, which attracted almost as much attention as the house, was also built of Chase County limestone. The three-story building stands against a south-sloping hill and measures about 110 by 60 feet. The bottom level has entry from the south, while the second floor is level with the top of the hill on the north. Two wide ramps lead from the ground to the third floor on the north. Jones could drive a team up one of the ramps, unload the wagon, make an easy turn, and leave by the other ramp.
It will take 5,000 pounds of tin to cover the mammoth barn of S.F. Jones on Fox Creek, and the tinners are laying it on. From the Strong City Independent, December 24, 1881.
When the barn was completed, Jones learned it lacked being the largest in Kansas by a mere 2 feet. Jones spent a grand total of about $40,000 on his house and barn, $25,000 or so going into the house alone. Folks say the individually cut stones, expensively shaped to the same size, would be nearly impossible to reproduce today. Soon after Jones' arrival in Kansas, residents of the area decided they needed a school. Jones donated land for a building about a half-mile north of his ranch house, and the first term began in September of 1884. The Lower Fox Creek School, as it was called, enrolled anywhere from 1 to 19 students a year, including all 8 grades. It was used until 1930, when the district disbanded. The house was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1971. 3 years later, in 1974, the Lower Fox Creek School building was added to the National Register. Over the years, the ranch has had a number of owners, and its name has undergone some interesting changes. Jones sold the ranch in 1888 to Barney Lantry for $95,000. Lantry, who had come to Chase County a year before Jones, was involved in railroad construction and had in fact built the Cog Railroad line to the summit of Pikes Peak in Colorado. Lantry called his ranch Deer Park Place because he kept a small herd of deer for his own amusement. The ranch passed through several more hands over the years and by 1935 was called Davis Ranch. The romance of the earlier names, the Spring Hill Ranch or Deer Park Place, was definitely missing when in 1955 the name was changed to the Davis Nolan Merrill Grain Company Ranch. Finally, though, in 1975, the company merged with the Z-Bar Cattle Company and the property became the Z-Bar Ranch. Today, it's still cattle country in the Flint Hills, and much of the Z-Bar Spring Hill Ranch is still a working cattle ranch. The lush prairie grasses provide rich feeding for the cattle, which are fattened on the ranch's nearly 11,000 acres. And it takes real cowboys and cowgirls to do the not always glamorous job of moving the cattle from place to place. Cattle are brought to the ranch from across the Midwest to fatten up on the lush blue-stem grass. Once unloaded from the trucks, the herd is moved in small groups to various parts of the hills. There they will graze until it's time to be taken off the grass and moved to feedlots or, more directly, to dinner tables around the world. At roundup time, it's often necessary to call on some help from neighboring ranchers who are glad to trade their labor for reciprocal help later on. The Z-Bar Spring Hill Ranch is only one of many in the Flint Hills. Their names reflect their location, or maybe even some of the wilder inhabitants. Many Flint Hills ranches have been part of the same families for generations, and through years of experimentation, most ranchers have learned how to assure the return of nutritious grass year after year. One of the ways is with fire. The Tallgrass Prairie was well managed for centuries without the help of man. An intricate interweaving of fire and wind, along with millions of grazing nomadic animals such as the buffalo, combined to keep the prairie alive and stable. Today, cattle have replaced the buffalo, but man has devised his own ways of seeing that the seeds of trees and other unwanted plants, borne in by the wind and birds, don't gain a toehold. Regular controlled burning kills the small trees and shrubs, but doesn't harm the grasses, whose roots reach as deep as 12 or 15 feet into the ground. North of the Z-Bar, along Interstate 70, the Kanza Prairie is the largest tallgrass research laboratory in the world. There, Kansas State University researchers burn parcels of land at various intervals to study its long-term effect on plants, soil, and animals. The history and culture of the Z-Bar Spring Hill Ranch and the surrounding area is reflected in a number of events each year. It begins with a true cowboy activity, the Flint Hills Rodeo in Strong City. One of the largest in Kansas, the rodeo attracts many cowboys and cowgirls who are among the world's best in their events. The rodeo began in 1937 in a pasture on the Emmett Roberts Ranch near Strong City. The Roberts family has produced several world champions. North of the ranch, Council Grove recalls its own past with Washunga days.
My press will do that.
And to the east, the city of Emporia, which bills itself as the front porch to the Flint Hills, celebrates with the Twin Rivers Festival. Today, the Z-Bar Spring Hill Ranch is owned and operated by the National Park Trust, a private, nonprofit land conservancy dedicated to saving parklands and resources throughout the country. With limited resources, the National Park Trust has made it possible for visitors to tour the house and other buildings and to explore the prairie itself. A nature trail winds 1 3/4 miles through prairie and stream bed to the Fox Creek School and back again. On the trail, newcomers to the Tallgrass Prairie learn that there's a lot more to it than can be seen from a highway in a speeding vehicle. Here, colors that from afar blended into a quilt of green take on individual shade. Plant and animal life unseen from the asphalt byway becomes real and fascinating. On the ranch are hundreds of species of native plants and grasses. Take a moment in your walk and get on an eye-to-eye basis with the prairie grasses like the big bluestem, little bluestem, Indian grass, and switchgrass, to name a few. The spots of color that you might have simply sensed rather than seen from out there a ways suddenly become brilliant and intense when you get real personal with them. Maybe it's an evening primrose or purple prairie clover, blue sage, gay feather, purple coneflower, or Maximilian sunflower. Go ahead, get close and get acquainted. When you do, you're one of the lucky ones. Down near the water, alongside Fox Creek or one of the tiny trickles that drain the hills, you'll find most of the few trees that manage to survive. Here are cottonwoods and willow and hackberry that throw shade like a prairie umbrella and provide habitat for the primary inhabitants of the Flint Hills. Nearly 200 kinds of birds, 29 species of reptiles and amphibians, and 31 species of mammals are found on the property. But you must often look closely and with a discerning eye, for a quickly darting bird or squirrel can, in the blink of an eye, disappear into the lush grasses. In geologic time, a blink of an eye is about all it has taken for the grasslands of North America to virtually disappear. It's the peanut-shaped area of the Flint Hills that remains. We can't look away. We can't blink our eyes and then be surprised that another part of this last vestige of the tallgrass is disappearing like the ruts of the Santa Fe Trail. So get close and look, and enjoy this tiny remnant of what we have left.
The wild tallgrass prairie must be allowed to seep into all of America's consciousness. From it, we can reread our history and our character. Isn't there some correlation between a free, open landscape and a free, open people? From Tallgrass Prairie, the Inland Sea, by Patricia D. Duncan.
Careful management and insightful planning will help preserve what is one of the last remaining segments of the once vast tallgrass prairie. Here in the Flint Hills of Kansas, at the Z-Bar Spring Hill Ranch, a heartfelt effort is being made toward that end.
We are still in transition from the notion of man as master of the earth to the notion of man as a part of it. Wallace Stegner, from A Capsule History of Conservation, 1990.